Sorry, that's always the first thing I have to do, adjust the microphone. First of all, can I thank Joe for the invitation. Yet again, this is a phenomenal week of discussion and debate, and hopefully some new thinking and some new ideas. And I know that the people who come here, in general, come here with an open mind in terms of listening and developing new ideas that can help their country. And I think that it is an extraordinary testament to the success of this summer school, the coverage that it gets day after day, and the numbers of people and the type of people that travel from long distances to be here. So thank you, Joe, and well done again on a great success, because I mightn't get a chance to say it later. The Ireland to which we are true is the ideal Ireland, which means there's always something more to strive for. But true devotion lies not in melodramatic self-sacrifice or defiance, but in the steady, earnest effort in the face of real, actual possibilities to work towards our hopes and visions. The laying of stone upon stone. That's a quote of a young Cork man who was killed in the Civil War a few months before he died, who had an aspiration to build a new Ireland, an independent, proud one. But I think the quote is one that is very relevant in terms of what we're trying to do today as a country. Forget about who's in government, and think about the country for a second. What do we need to do to create jobs, to change a mindset here so that people become more optimistic about the future, to ensure that they can access, with that change in mindset, funds that can allow them to take risk, to set up companies, to take on jobs, to exploit their own potential in a way that, in many ways, my generation and those that came after me during the Celtic Tiger were so confident at doing. Because ultimately that is what we need to do. There is no government stimulus package which will solve all of Ireland's problems. It'll be people themselves who will be the stimulus package. It'll be companies that come here to invest here. It'll be Irish people borrowing money, taking risk, employing people. It will be the private sector themselves who will stimulate recovery in this country, just like we did at the start of the Celtic Tiger period at the end of the 90s. And that will happen because I hope government and policymakers, through government and opposition and the friction that must happen there to get the best out of government, will lay the conditions to allow that to happen. And that is what we must do despite all of the challenges that we face. We must rebuild an economy and a country stone by stone. And that is why weeks like this are part of that process. To push people like me to think differently, to be more ambitious about the targets that we're setting and how we get there. But I think that the sort of party political stuff that we sometimes hear, which is that everything that the government is doing is a disaster, and sure, only if you had us in government everything would be fine, to be perfectly honest with you, is a load of nonsense. This government has made some mistakes, but it has also done a lot of very positive things. This week I spent a day and a half in 3 different countries, trying to ensure that people understand Ireland's concerns and aspirations around the common agricultural policy and the common fisheries policy and its future. And I can tell you both of those policies are vital for this county. I was in Germany, I was in Rome, and I was in Budapest. 3 very different countries. One, in many ways, the most dominant player in Europe politically and economically. Another, Italy, in fear of an impending crisis that may spread from Spain into their country, but is already a fundamental problem within the Italian economy. And another, Hungary, a new member state with different perspectives on a whole series of things, but who are currently talking to the IMF about accessing money without going into a formal bailout. And before we spoke about the CAP or the CFP, which is what I was there for, we spoke about our countries and the challenges that they faced and the responses that they were putting in place to try and meet those challenges. And I can tell you that all three of those countries spoke to me about Ireland and how they perceived Ireland and the journey we have come on over the last 18 months. This country that they saw imploding 18 months ago, with a banking system that could no longer function, with a debt that everybody accepted was totally unsustainable, that was going into a bailout program at the start of that, was essentially being taken control of by outsiders in terms of target setting because we could no longer run our own country, to now being seen as an example of how a country can start to turn itself around, of how people can work through political change rather than by burning buildings down, to actually force a change in policy and a change in mindset and a new way of doing things that can bring about some optimism and some change. They spoke about how could Ireland actually create growth last year, albeit small growth of 1.4%, while being in a bailout, while taking so much money out of an economy, out of households, by both reduced expenditure and increased taxation. And they now speak about our country as a country that is no longer in crisis, but a country that is in recovery, going through a very painful correction period. And often they don't realise the kind of pain that many people are going through in Ireland. And people like me need to remind them of it. Because sometimes there is this assumption that actually Ireland is out of the woods, that we're going to be the first country to come out of a bailout and to be able to raise our own finances and move forward on the basis primarily of export-led growth, which will translate into domestic stimulus in time to deal with unemployment problems. It's not that easy. We all know that. But I think the very fact that the way in which outsiders view our country is so different to the way we ourselves view our country, I think says an awful lot about the kind of trauma that we've been through as a people over the last 4 or 5 years. And how do we move on from that and start to focus in on the options that are narrowed for Ireland? And the actual title of this debate, with huge debt and resulting austerity, is serious growth possible? And in the very last sentence of the introduction, which is a pretty pessimistic one, I have to say, of the context of this debate, we're told we are still in a bad place with few options. We are in a difficult place. And we do have less options than we had in the past. But we do have plenty of options all the same. And it is the job of government to find those options, to develop them and turn them into opportunities that can bring stimulus and growth and optimism back for people. And we are doing that. Not perfectly, but we are doing that. We have rebuilt a banking infrastructure in Ireland that is not perfect, but it is on its way towards some kind of normalised banking system that is the right size for the Irish economy rather than what it was. We have renegotiated our bailout conditions over and over again with the Troika. We have taken advantage of pressures that have been put on by other countries like Greece and Spain to be able to get a better deal for Ireland, sometimes on the coattails of what other countries have forced in terms of change and new thinking. But that is the political responsibility of a small country that can't bring about European change on its own. The responsibility on us is to find ways of bringing about an improved set of conditions in relation to our bailout and using other countries to be able to do that. And I think we've done that to good effect. Last summer, when we saw a reduction in the cost of finance through bailout funds for us, following a crisis in Greece, and again this summer now, following the new demands of Spain to avoid a collapse there in terms of banking debt, we have used that skillfully to be able to ensure that what applies to Spain in terms of the separation of sovereign debt versus bank debt in terms of how it's treated and seen as an opportunity for a new departure in Ireland also to try and deal with this extraordinary debt burden that all of us have been asked to carry because of mistakes in the past. We also, through this process, have met every target that has been set for us by the Troika. As uncomfortable as that is, I've been nearly 15 years in politics. I never thought that when I got the opportunity and the privilege of being in government, I'd have my targets set for me by outsiders. But that's the reality of the Ireland that we need to lead and that you need to live in. And when people tell you that, look, it is unfair to make cutbacks in certain areas or to introduce taxes on people who can't afford to pay them, they're right, it is unfair. But there is a lot that is unfair about Ireland at the moment. And we need to try and work through that process, and actually, while doing that, if we're going to keep people with us, we have to be able to convince them that it's working, that we're moving in a direction that is actually the right direction. And the one thing that Mary Lou said that I agree with her strongly on is that unemployment is still too high in Ireland, far too high. And it's an area where we haven't made the kind of progress that we would have liked to have made. But if you look at some of the other sectors that are actually functioning and working, if you look at what is going to drive recovery in Ireland, which is what Carl referred to towards the end of his talk, he talked about Ireland being driven by export-led growth. If you look at what's happening in those areas, that is happening. This year, the IDA and Enterprise Ireland combined are creating about 2,000 jobs a month in Ireland. The kind of capital investment that helps to stimulate an economy doesn't only come from a government and from taxpayers. It can come from new companies coming here and building factories and manufacturing facilities and supply networks also. It can come from private companies like recently we've seen a new energy project being announced that's going to connect wind turbines built in Ireland directly through a direct current line into the British grid, where energy consumers will essentially be building infrastructure here in Ireland for the UK electricity grid. That's the kind of innovative thinking that we need to have when it is difficult to create growth, and we need to find ways of doing it by new thinking, looking for new opportunities, as opposed to the old argument, which is so stale, which says the only way we can get stimulus in Ireland is if the government spends more money. The government needs to find ways of spending public money to promote stimulus too. Of course it does. And this idea that we are somehow late arrivers to the doctrine of the need for stimulus is such nonsense. We've been in government for less than 18 months. Every week we've been dealing with a mini crisis. And through that period we have been trying to put in place steady policies that can make Ireland a more competitive place, a more attractive place to do business, to try and reduce red tape for companies, to try and make it easier and more tax efficient for people to be employed. We have made it clear, even through a very difficult budget last year, that we would not increase income tax, that we would not increase tax on employment, because almost everything we are doing, with the exception of social services like healthcare, is solely revolving around employment and trying to make it easier for people to employ people. And we will continue to do that. And there is no one stimulus or no one jobs initiative or no one jobs action plan which will solve all of our problems. But all of them combined will make a big difference. And so when we had a jobs initiative over a year ago, which cost the country about 700 million euros, which was about giving favourable tax treatment to the hospitality and catering sector in terms of VAT reductions, that had its impact in a sector which was positive. Whether it's the jobs action plan that Richard Bruton is going to run every year, It's going to be an annual series of actions that departments and ministers will have to deliver upon that actually come from businesses. We don't make these up. They come from businesses so that we can try and make life easier for those businesses. Whether it's the stimulus plan that has recently been announced by the government to the tune of about €2.25 billion that otherwise wouldn't have been spent on building schools, building courthouses, building primary healthcare centres, building a number of roads in different parts of the country, or whether it's phase 2 of that stimulus plan, which we will see in the not too distant future. This adds to the series of measures and initiatives that we need right now. Whether it's the sale of certain state assets to help fund that stimulus, which you will see next year. And by the way, on the state asset issue, can I just say this to you? The sole motivation for selling state assets is not to raise money. Any country worth its salt should look at the companies that it owns and the assets that it owns every now and again, and make strategic decisions about what it should sell, what it could keep, what it should keep, how they are managed, whether they should create new state assets, look at what is strategic for the future of a state and what is not, look at what is more appropriate to be in private ownership in terms of driving efficiencies, and look at what is not. And that is what we are doing at the moment. The idea that the state needs to own 3 or 4 energy companies is nonsense. We don't need to own Bord Gáis Energy, which is a successful, profitable company. And we'll sell it and we will reinvest the money that we raise in that to build a new semi-state company that we do need. Through the structures of Bord Gáis, actually, as it happens, it'll be a new water company. And that is strategic thinking. Selling one asset that you don't strategically need any longer because we already have a whole series of state-owned energy generation interests, so that we can raise money to build a new state asset that we do need, to build a new water infrastructure managed under one commercial entity as opposed to being managed under 37 different local authorities in a very inefficient way that results in 50% of the water in our pipes leaking out of those pipes before it even gets to its destination, costing taxpayers €1.2 billion a year. Is that good value? So this is about reform. It's about changing the way we do things. It's not just about selling the family silver to raise some money to pay off banks that have been bailed out, or whatever political sort of catcalling you want in relation to that. I think Carl pointed out very clearly, Ireland's problems are not solely related to bank bailouts. That is part of our problem. It's a particularly sore one for people to have to stomach, but it is only part of our problem. We also, outside of any of our debt issues, have enormous challenges to face in terms of deficit that is a result of overspending and earning in terms of the receipts that we're bringing in at the moment, because of a totally unsustainable tax base that was built up during the Celtic Tiger on the back of a property sector. And that is a bigger challenge in terms of what is required at budget time than the bank debt is. And it's important that we just are upfront about that. The idea that banks made decisions as privately owned banks that has now resulted in debt being foisted upon the shoulders of the public in Ireland is a stomach-churning unfairness that people are rightly very, very angry about. And, you know, looking at our TV screens over the last number of days, I think a lot of people would have been satisfied that actually some people are now being brought to book and brought to account over those mistakes. But getting rid of bank debt in the morning doesn't solve Ireland's problems. It will help, but it doesn't solve Ireland's problems. So can I say this to you? We essentially have 3 fundamental challenges in Ireland that we need to progress now as part of a national project of recovery. The first is that we need to restore order to our public finances, and we are on the journey to do that. In fact, we are ahead of schedule in terms of deficit management. And that involves more pain. And it's hard to sell pain as a politician, I can tell you. But it's the truth. We are going to have a tough budget this autumn because we need to continue to close this gap between what we earn and what we spend. We don't want to do it too quickly, because the consequences for that in terms of families is devastating. So we have to do it over a time period and try and manage that by in somehow protecting vulnerable people from the effects of those cuts and so on. And that is a difficult political debate, and it's a debate that the opposition need to be really involved in and hold the government to account on. And as I say, this government has made some mistakes in that area in the budget last year, some of which we've changed as a result of opposition parties pointing out those mistakes. But we must continue on that journey if we're to have any credibility at all. And we must continue to stay on that journey if we hope to get out of the bailout programme that we are currently in and regain independent decision-making in this country again in terms of sovereignty. And I think people are maybe too quick to talk about a loss of sovereignty sometimes in the context of the Troika bailout programme, but certainly the decision-making at budget time is something that I would like to see back in the hands of government once again in a more real sense. The second issue that we need to deal with, of course, is we need to deal with our levels of debt. Michael Noonan, who has a good turn of phrase, said that trying to run an economy that has too much debt is like trying to drive a car with the handbrake on. And that is a bit what it's like, what the Irish economy is currently like. That we are trying to create more tax income, and we are managing to do that. Tax take is up. Tax take is up in the first half of this year in terms of income tax by 8% on last year. It's 3% ahead of expectations for this year. So anyone who says that all of the economic indicators are pointing in the wrong direction, I don't know how you could ignore income tax, or VAT, for example. But some people choose to do that. We need to find a way to restructure debt that has been created through banking, which represents about a quarter of that debt, about 64 billion. And also the other debt that continues to be incurred as we continue to run deficits and actually have to borrow money to make up the difference. We need to find a way of making that debt more affordable, and we need to restructure it. And we are in a process of doing that. And the fact that we can now, hopefully, figure out a way with the Troika of separating bank debt from sovereign debt in the context of what was agreed with Spain is an exciting prospect that will certainly help Ireland, but will not solve all of our problems. And that is, I hope, going to be a decision that will be taken by mid to the end of October with our European partners. And then the third area, which is the most exciting and challenging area, is we need to find a way of getting growth into our economy. And we need to find a way of linking what is a strong growth sector in the economy, i.e. an exporting sector for both Irish companies and for multinationals that are here, and actually linking that to creating stimulus within the domestic economy. Because the real challenge here is that despite the fact that last year we saw over 5% growth in terms of exports in Ireland, and over 12% growth in my sector in terms of agri-food. And this year we're seeing similar growth. In the first 6 months of this year, it was over 6% growth in terms of exports, again this year. But unfortunately, exporting companies are not big employers in general. They employ about 20% of the population. The other 80% are employed in the domestic economy, in the retail sector, in local manufacturing, and in a whole series of other service sectors, and so on. We have a flat and stagnant domestic economy at the moment in terms of consumer spending, which is linked to the kind of personal debt that Carl spoke about, as well as the total lack of confidence that has come from 4 years of battering in terms of both media coverage of where Ireland is at and where it's going, and also in terms of personal experiences around losing employment, seeing salaries fall, seeing members of your family having to leave the country to try and find employment, and all of the other really negative stories that some of which Mary Lou referred to, and rightly so. So how do we do that? And I'll maybe finish on this because I know people want to get to questions. We do it by a whole series of strategies and proposals that together add up to something significant in terms of stimulus packages, jobs action plans, jobs initiatives, clever taxation policy, state agency support for businesses in terms of mentoring, looking at new ways of doing things. Speaking to the guys from Change Ireland earlier about a fantastic mentoring and education program for young teenage entrepreneurs in Kerry, which is growing a whole crop of entrepreneurs that will have the capacity and the confidence to take risk when they enter their 20s and 30s, which will have a stimulus impact in itself. We also need to look at, and I'm a big believer in this, and I often call it the Ardnacrusha effect. We need to look for big opportunities in the Irish economy that actually are not being exploited at the moment, that can be exploited. And one of the areas that I think where there is a massive opportunity at the moment is in the energy sector. And I know Pat Rabbitt will be here, I think he's here tomorrow, and you can question him on that. But the concept actually of linking the Irish electricity grid with the British electricity grid, which we're required to do anyway under EU law, offers an extraordinary potential for Ireland to be able to produce thousands of megawatts of renewable energy on potentially state-owned land, on estates that may be owned at the moment by Coillte and or Bord-na-Mona, to be able to provide direct current electricity into the UK grid, which has a huge demand for extra energy at the moment and a huge shortage of renewable energy at the moment. We may look to actually put in place a government-to-government energy supply contract between Ireland and the UK to that effect, which could be an enormous stimulus in itself, because there is no shortage of private sector money willing to invest in the physical building of wind infrastructure in particular, as long as you're linked to a grid like the British grid, which will actually pay for that through the ROC system that's there. That type of thinking, or indeed the thinking that we have in my department around the opportunities, for example, for the dairy industry when quotas go in 2015, and the actual build-up to that in terms of the investment and capital investment that is underway at the moment on so many dairy farms across the country, which we are partly sponsoring, but which the private sector primarily is actually funding. We are planning between 2015 and 2020 to increase the volume of milk produced in Ireland by 50% in 5 years. The jobs spin-off and jobs dividend from that is extraordinary. And if you look at what the companies in this sector are actually doing at the moment, and you begin to realise the potential of that growth, it's exciting. Kerry Group, for example, which many of you will associate with being a dairy cooperative in Listowel in Kerry, is now a world nutrition company that actually has a turnover of €5 billion last year, that employs 24,000 people in 70 different countries. These are the kind of companies that we can build out of Ireland. And this is the kind of growth that will lift Ireland out of the darkness. It's not going to be solely government-led. Government must create the conditions for others to stimulate growth and to prosper. And yes, we must take the initiative when others can't spend money to find ways of spending money in an off-balance sheet manner. That's why we're using PPPs. If we weren't using PPPs, we would not be able to spend the €2.25 billion without actually adding that to the government's deficit and balance sheet, which in itself causes problems. That's why we're doing it. It's also because the private sector is better at certain things. It's not better at other things. And so it's a strategic decision for a number of reasons. So I'm very optimistic about where Ireland is going. But I'm not someone who's going to sell some kind of big bang solution that will solve everybody's problems and put everybody back to work and bring everybody home who's had to leave the country. I'm afraid it's not that easy. This is a painful adjustment period for Ireland, where we are having to pay for the policy mistakes of 10 years of reckless banking and poor governance. That's the truth. And people don't like to hear it, but it's the truth. And some of us were reckless as part of that. And we are now in a correction period being supervised by a troika, because the troika are the only people who are willing to lend Ireland money under the current circumstances. Thanks be to God, that's starting to change. And I think the greatest indication that Ireland is moving in the right direction is that we are actually now able to raise our own money again. When the NTMA went to the markets, when they issued a 3-month paper, a lot of people were wondering whether they'd be able to find buyers. They nearly had twice as many buyers as there was available paper to sell. And they sold it at an interest rate or a yield of 1.8%. Many people said that if we could get 2%, we'd be doing really well. The perception of Ireland from outside of Ireland is that we are moving in the right direction, and we must keep moving in that direction. We need to create the same perception at home, that actually we must stick this out, even though it's difficult. There are no simplistic, easy solutions. But if we keep moving in the right direction, if we keep putting both government and indeed the private sector under pressure to produce more from less through new thinking and reform, well then in my view the future of Ireland is very positive indeed. And I look forward to being part of that. Thank you very much.